In the soft afternoon light of a Charleston parlor in 1838, there stands a young woman whose face reveals a contradiction too profound to hide. Her name is Elizabeth Harrison, and this daguerreotype captures her at a moment when her entire world was about to shatter like aged glass. She wears the finest white cotton dress that Charleston's most expensive seamstress could fashion, not slavery cotton, as she would later insist to herself, but cotton nonetheless, stained with the blood of thousands. Lace cuffs frame her delicate hands. Her dark hair is perfectly arranged. She is, by any measure of her time and class, a vision of Southern privilege and beauty. Yet her face tells a different story. There is something unsettled about her expression. Her eyes do not meet the camera directly, as was proper for a young woman of her station. Instead, they look away, toward the ornate window where a shadow moves, a shadow darker than any piece of furniture should cast. The shadow of a man, the shadow of Thomas. And in that single glance away from respectability, Elizabeth Harrison revealed everything. Behind her in the photograph, paintings line the walls of her family's mansion. In one, enslaved people work in fields under a burning sun. In another, auctioneers stand before crowds of human beings being sold like cattle. These are not paintings of horror or critique. These are paintings of wealth, displayed in the parlor of the Harrison family as proudly as aristocrats might display hunting trophies. Because this is what the Harrison fortune was built upon, not cotton alone, though they own that too, but the traffic in human beings, the buying and selling of people at auction on the docks of Charleston, where ships arrive from the interior with cargo that would break your heart if you allowed yourself to look directly at it. Elizabeth's father, James Harrison, was one of Charleston's most successful slave traders, not a slave owner merely, though he was that too, but a trader, a man who made his living buying enslaved people in bulk from plantation owners and selling them at auction to other plantation owners, a middleman in the most immoral commerce ever conducted. By 1838, James Harrison had made a fortune so vast that it seemed to render him immune to consequences. He had connections in every branch of Southern politics. He had helped elect governors. He had dined with senators. He had the protection of the law and the blessing of the church. His daughter, by every measure of Southern society, should have been content. She had everything any young woman of her class could desire. She had security. She had status. She had the promise of a brilliant marriage to one of Charleston's most prominent families. She had been raised to believe that her position was natural, ordained by God, and entirely right. But Elizabeth Harrison had made the catastrophic mistake of having a conscience, and worse, she had made the even more dangerous mistake of falling in love. The first time Elizabeth saw Thomas, she did not realize what she was looking at. He was brought into the household in 1835, when she was still a child of 15, barely old enough to notice the servants around her. He was just another enslaved person in a house full of them, though unlike the others, he had been purchased not from an auction, but from her father's private collection. Her father had bought him specifically because he was young, strong, and able to read and write, qualifications that made him valuable as a personal servant. Thomas's presence in the household was meant to be invisible. This was the Southern way. Enslaved people were supposed to fade into the background, present but unnoticed, like furniture or walls. But Thomas had never been good at fading. Even in slavery, even with the weight of bondage upon him, Thomas carried himself with a presence that was impossible to ignore. Elizabeth first truly noticed him on a humid afternoon in the summer of 1837, when she was organizing her father's library. Thomas was there to assist her, a task her father had assigned him, believing that even an enslaved man could be trusted with books. She was reaching for a volume on the highest shelf when she nearly fell. Thomas caught her, his hand steady on her arm, and for a moment their eyes met. In that moment, something shifted in the universe. Some invisible law broke. She was 17. He was 31. She had never worked a day in her life. He had worked since childhood, carried on ships as a child, stripped of his name and given only Thomas, forced to wear the chains of captivity. And yet, in that moment of falling and being caught, Elizabeth Harrison saw him not as a servant or as property, or as the invisible machinery of her privileged existence. She saw him as a person, a human being, a man. It was the most dangerous realization of her life. Her father, James Harrison, was a man shaped entirely by profit. He had no hobbies, no intellectual interests, no pleasures except those that could be converted into financial advantage. He rose early, worked methodically through his transactions, and retired late, always calculating, always scheming how to expand his network of suppliers and buyers. He was, by the standards of his time and place, a successful man. By the standards of humanity, he was a monster, though he would have been deeply hurt and confused by this characterization. He did not see himself as a monster. He saw himself as a businessman taking advantage of natural economic laws. It was this moral blindness that made him so efficient at his work. James Harrison's auction house was located near the docks of Charleston, in a building designed specifically for the purpose of selling human beings. The architecture was calculated to maximize profit. The auction block was elevated so that buyers could see the merchandise clearly. The pens where enslaved people were kept during the days before sale were designed to be easily cleaned of blood and bodily waste. The business was conducted with the same efficient cruelty with which one might manage the sale of livestock. But what distinguished James Harrison from merely cruel men was his success at making the entire enterprise seem normal, respectable, even virtuous. He attended church regularly. He gave money to charities that existed to help white widows and orphans. He was a founding member of the society that built Charleston's most prestigious boys' school. He had friends in Congress. He was invited to the best parties. In every way that mattered to Charleston society, James Harrison was a respectable man. His wife Margaret had stopped questioning his work sometime around their 5th year of marriage. She simply did not ask what his business involved. She enjoyed the wealth it produced, the fine clothes, the spacious house, the servants. She did not allow herself to think about where it came from. This was a skill that many white Southern women had cultivated to perfection, the ability to benefit from slavery while maintaining the fiction that they had no responsibility for it, the ability to love their husbands while hating what they did, the ability to live comfortably in contradiction. Elizabeth, however, had not yet learned this skill. It began with questions. In the summer of 1837, Elizabeth began to notice things about her father's work that she had never permitted herself to see before. She noticed the auction announcements in the Charleston newspapers, the lists of human beings being offered for sale. She noticed the sounds coming from the pens near the docks on days when her father took business trips there. She noticed that sometimes enslaved people who had been in the household disappeared, and when she asked where they had gone, the response was always evasive. She began to read. Not the novels and poetry that young women of her class were supposed to read, but abolitionist literature. She obtained copies of pamphlets distributed by Northern abolitionists, read the speeches of William Lloyd Garrison, studied the arguments of people who claimed that slavery was not just evil, but economically inefficient, not just immoral, but unchristian. She hid these materials in the bottom of a writing desk in her bedroom, behind false panels that she discovered by accident. Every night, after the household had gone to sleep, she would read by candlelight, absorbing ideas that were supposed to be dangerous, subversive, and absolutely wrong. They were subversive, they were dangerous, and they were absolutely right. But the abolitionist literature, powerful as it was, remained abstract. Slavery was an evil system, yes, but it happened far away to people she did not know, on plantations she would never see. It was possible to acknowledge the evil while still maintaining emotional distance from it. It was possible to sympathize intellectually while maintaining social complicity, until Thomas. By the spring of 1838, something had shifted between Elizabeth and Thomas that went far beyond the careful master-servant relationship that was supposed to exist between them. During the times when she was alone in the library, she would ask him questions about his life before slavery. He would answer carefully, always aware that his words could be reported to her father and would result in his being sold or beaten or both. She began to leave books out on the library table, volumes of poetry, history, philosophy, and he would read them at night, returning them before morning. She would mark passages that spoke to freedom, to human dignity, to the possibility that the existing order was not inevitable but could be changed. When her father was away on business trips to inspect the auction house, she would sometimes find excuses to spend time in rooms where Thomas was working. Once, she deliberately spilled ink on her dress and asked him to help her clean it off, just so that his hands might touch her hands for a moment without the entire household noticing. She was falling in love with him in the only way she knew how, secretly, desperately, with the knowledge that what she was doing was not just inappropriate but dangerous. Her feelings were not unique. Across the South, white women had feelings for enslaved men, but those feelings were almost always denied, suppressed, hidden away in the depths of consciousness where they could not be acknowledged or acted upon. Elizabeth, however, was beginning to understand that denial and suppression were no longer possible for her. Not anymore. In the late summer of 1838, James Harrison announced that he was planning a trip to New Orleans to conduct business. He would be gone for 2 weeks. For Elizabeth, the news arrived like a sentence of death, not because he was leaving, but because she understood what that meant. The night before he was scheduled to depart, she waited until the household had gone to sleep. She made her way to the kitchen, where Thomas slept in a small room attached to the main house. She knew she was making an irrevocable choice. She knew that if she was discovered, if word of this reached her father or any member of Charleston society, her reputation would be destroyed. She would be marked as damaged, unfit for any respectable marriage, an embarrassment to her family. She did not care anymore. She found Thomas sitting by a window, reading one of the books she had left for him. When he saw her, his expression changed from shock to something deeper, something that suggested he had been waiting for this moment, dreading it and longing for it simultaneously. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly. "I know," she replied. "If anyone sees you, I don't care anymore, and I don't think you should care either." For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the small room. Then Thomas stood, and for the first time, he allowed himself to bridge the distance between them. He took her hand, not as a servant would take the hand of his mistress for some small task, but as a man takes the hand of the woman he loves. His grip was gentle but firm, and in that grip was contained all the risk, all the passion, all the defiance of a man who had survived slavery and was now willing to risk everything for the possibility of freedom with the woman he loved. "We cannot stay in Charleston," Thomas said. "Your father will never permit this. He will kill me if he discovers us." "I know," Elizabeth said, "but I don't know what to do. I have no money of my own. I have no skills. I am entirely dependent on my father." "Then we must wait," Thomas said. "We must wait until an opportunity presents itself. There are people in the North who help people like us escape. I have heard stories, rumors pass between enslaved people about a network, a path to freedom." "The Underground Railroad," Elizabeth whispered. She had read about it in the abolitionist literature she had been consuming in secret. "Yes," Thomas said. "If we can reach Philadelphia, we can be married there. We can be free." It was a fantasy, but it was a fantasy that transformed despair into possibility. And sometimes, possibility is all that is necessary to begin to imagine a different future. Elizabeth left his room before dawn, returning to her own bed as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. She had crossed a threshold that could not be uncrossed. She had chosen love over security. She had chosen humanity over respectability. And she had no idea what was coming. The first time James Harrison discovered the truth, it was entirely by accident. It was a cold December morning in 1838, 3 months after Elizabeth had gone to Thomas's room. 3 months of stolen glances and carefully constructed lies. She had become expert at deception, at managing her facial expressions during family dinners, at maintaining the fiction of an obedient daughter while her entire inner world had shifted on its axis. But accidents are what destroy careful plans. An accident destroyed hers. Her father had come home early from the auction house with a migraine, something that happened perhaps twice a year, and he had instructed the household staff that he was not to be disturbed. Elizabeth, who had been upstairs in her room supposedly reading, heard him enter the study below and settle into his chair. She had waited approximately 1 hour before venturing downstairs, assuming he would be asleep. Instead, as she passed through the hallway toward the library, she nearly collided with Thomas, who was emerging from the study with her father's empty brandy glass. What made the moment catastrophic was not the collision itself. That could have been explained as coincidental proximity, but the fact that Thomas was carrying something else. A letter. A letter that was unmistakably in Elizabeth's handwriting, partially visible in his grip, addressed in terms that no servant should ever carry. Her father's voice came from the study before any of them could move. "Thomas, bring my glass back and tell the cook I need tea." Thomas, with the presence of mind of a man who had spent his entire life in situations where a single mistake meant death, immediately turned back toward the study, the letter disappearing into his coat pocket. Elizabeth stood frozen in the hallway, understanding with perfect clarity that everything had just changed, that the fragile architecture of secrecy they had constructed was about to collapse. She made her way to the library and tried to appear as though she had just arrived downstairs. Her hands trembled as she pulled books from shelves without seeing their titles. She could hear her father moving around in the study, could hear Thomas moving through the house with mechanical calm. She understood that Thomas would have seen the moment of discovery. He would know that James Harrison suspected something. When she finally saw her father at dinner that evening, he appeared entirely normal. He discussed business, complained about the weather, made remarks about the declining quality of tobacco. He did not look at Elizabeth directly. He did not mention anything unusual. This silence was far more terrifying than any confrontation could have been. It suggested calculation, a man considering his next move with the methodical precision that had made him successful in the trading of human beings. Elizabeth could barely eat. She moved food around her plate and excused herself as soon as was socially acceptable, claiming fatigue. Margaret barely noticed, occupied with her needlework. Only when Elizabeth was in her room, closing the door carefully behind her, did she begin to understand the shape of the disaster. The letter Thomas had been carrying. She could not remember exactly what it said, but she knew it was damning. She knew it could not be explained away, not by Thomas, not by her, not by any convenient story. 3 days of absolute silence passed. James Harrison continued to behave as though nothing had changed. He went to his office, conducted business, returned home for dinner. He treated Elizabeth with the same distant civility he had always shown her. And then, on the morning of the 4th day, he summoned her to his study. Elizabeth's heart was pounding so violently, she thought it might break through her ribs as she descended the stairs. She knocked on the heavy wooden door and heard her father's response to enter. He was sitting behind his desk, papers spread before him in the careful organization that characterized everything he did. He did not ask her to sit. "Sit," he said, and she realized she had been wrong. It was an order, not a suggestion. She sat in the leather chair across from him, and her father studied her with an expression she could not read. "Your mother does not know," he said finally. "I have made the decision that she does not need to know. However, I need to understand exactly how serious this situation has become." Elizabeth's mouth was dry. She could not speak. "I have been making inquiries," her father continued. "I have learned that Thomas can read. This is of course illegal. It is also a direct violation of my property rights. I purchased him with the understanding that he possessed certain basic skills, but literacy was explicitly not one of them. More concerning, I have learned that someone has been leaving books for him to read. I have not yet determined who that someone is." He paused, and Elizabeth understood he was giving her an opportunity to confess. She said nothing. "I have also been making inquiries about your recent behavior. You have been seen in the company of this man on multiple occasions, alone. This is inappropriate, more than inappropriate. It is dangerous, not physically, of course, morally, spiritually, socially." He leaned back in his chair, and his expression shifted into something almost paternal. "You are a beautiful young woman from one of Charleston's most prominent families. You have prospects that most girls would consider extraordinarily fortunate. I have been contacted by 3 respectable families about the possibility of marriage. I have considered each offer carefully. I had not yet decided which family would be most advantageous for the Harrison interests, but now I understand that I have been negligent. I need to move quickly. You will be married before spring. I have decided on the Ashford family. Their son, William, is 25 years old, has good business sense, and comes from appropriate stock. The engagement will be announced in January. The wedding will take place in March." Elizabeth felt the room shift slightly around her, as though she were drowning. "Father, You will not speak unless I ask you to speak. Is that understood?" She fell silent. "Your relationship with Thomas ends immediately. You will not speak to him. You will not leave him any correspondence. You will not acknowledge his existence beyond what is necessary for household operations. If I discover any violation of this directive, I will sell Thomas to a plantation in Louisiana before the week is over. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand that a man purchased as a field hand on a Louisiana plantation typically survives perhaps 3 years before the labor breaks him completely? Do you understand that his death would be the direct result of your continued contact with him?" Elizabeth understood. She understood perfectly. She also understood that her father had just threatened her with the slavery-induced death of the man she loved, unless she agreed to marry a stranger and never see Thomas again. She understood that this was precisely the kind of calculated cruelty her father excelled at. He was not acting on emotion or rage. He was optimizing. He was solving a problem. The fact that the problem was his daughter's heart, and that the solution involved destroying someone else's life, barely seemed to register with him as anything worthy of consideration. That night, Elizabeth could not sleep. She lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, understanding that everything had changed, that the fragile fantasy of escape she and Thomas had constructed was over. She had no money. She had no ability to purchase his freedom. She had no realistic means of fleeing with him. And now she understood with absolute clarity that her father's threats were not empty ones. James Harrison would sell Thomas exactly as casually as he would rearrange furniture. The only difference was that furniture did not suffer. That night, she made a decision. She would not marry William Ashford. She would not accept her father's solution. Instead, she would run. Not with Thomas, because involving him would guarantee his death, but alone, to the north, via the Underground Railroad network that she had read about in the abolitionist materials she still kept hidden in her room. She would reach Philadelphia. She would find employment. She would find a way to eventually return and purchase Thomas's freedom, or she would find a way to help him escape as well. It was a desperate plan, almost certainly impossible, but it was the only option her father had not already foreclosed. She began to prepare immediately. She withdrew small amounts of money from her household allowance, hiding them in a small silk purse she kept beneath her mattress. She read her abolitionist materials more carefully, searching for any hints about Underground Railroad stations, safe houses, the mechanics of escape. She wrote letters to Thomas in her head, composing words she would never be able to send. In them she explained that she was doing this for him, that she could not marry another man when she was already committed to him in every way that mattered. She understood the risk she was taking. If captured, she would be imprisoned or institutionalized. Her family would deny she had ever existed. But the alternative, a life of comfortable slavery to a man she did not love, watching Thomas be destroyed by circumstance and her father's deliberate malice, was worse. She managed to see Thomas only once after her father's ultimatum. It was by necessity in the library where they were supposed to avoid each other entirely, but where a conversation could plausibly be explained as her asking him to fetch a book from a high shelf. "I am leaving," she whispered while his back was turned to her as he pretended to search for the requested volume. "Not with you, alone. I cannot tell you more because knowing would endanger you." Thomas turned back to her, his face showing no change of expression, but his eyes conveying everything: shock, desperation, understanding. "You cannot—" "I must. If I stay, my father will sell you. If I leave, there is at least a chance that circumstances might change, that someday I might be able to help you. Elizabeth, if you are caught, I know, but I have no other options. My father has already arranged my marriage. He has made his intentions clear." Thomas handed her the book, and their fingers touched for perhaps half a second, a contact that felt like both agony and ecstasy. "I love you," she said, knowing it was the first time and the last time she would ever be able to say it out loud. "I love you," he replied, and then he was turning away, and she was holding the book, and a servant was entering the library, and the moment was over. The plan came together in fragments. Elizabeth had noticed in one of her hidden abolitionist pamphlets a reference to a contact in Philadelphia, a man named William Still, who ran something called the Vigilance Committee and helped fugitives settle and find employment. She did not have a way to contact him directly, but she had found the name of a Quaker family in Charleston, the Thorndikes, who were known to have abolitionist sympathies. She had also found a map in one of her father's old books that showed routes north, marked with river crossings and towns she had never heard of. She began to memorize these names and locations. She identified the household funds that would be most vulnerable to her, taking small amounts without immediate detection. She studied the servant schedules to understand when she could move through the house unobserved. She made notes about which clothes she would need, practical items, not the silk and lace gowns that defined her station. She practiced moving quietly through her room, opening and closing drawers without sound. She was preparing for departure with the methodical care of someone who understood that a single mistake would destroy everything. The engagement announcement was scheduled for January 10th, 1839. There would be a formal party. The Ashford family would be present. Prominent families from Charleston would attend. It would be, her father explained to her with evident satisfaction, one of the social events of the season. Elizabeth understood that after this party, her fate would be sealed. Marriage preparations would accelerate. She would be transferred to the Ashford household. She would become a wife, a broodmare for the perpetuation of a line that would eventually produce children who would themselves become slaveholders. It was not going to happen. She left on January 8th, 2 days before the engagement party, in the only way that made sense. She waited until the household was asleep, gathered the small bag of clothing and money she had prepared, and walked out of the house into the frozen Charleston night. She had worn a dark dress, practical shoes, and she had pulled her hair back and covered it with a bonnet that made her look older, less like a young woman of prominent family, and more like a servant or a traveling companion. She had left no note. She had made no formal farewell. She had simply walked away from everything, her family, her name, her social position, her entire life as she had known it, and moved into the dark streets of Charleston with a single destination in mind, the house of the Thorndike family, where she hoped that the rumors about their abolitionist sympathies were true, and where she prayed they would be willing to help a desperate young woman escape the life that was being forced upon her. The Thorndike family residence was located in an older neighborhood, not far from the waterfront, in a section of Charleston where merchant families clustered. It was a modest house by the standards of Elizabeth's upbringing, 2 stories with a practical garden and no ornamental columns or sweeping lawns. Elizabeth had never been here, would have had no social reason to be here, but she had studied the address carefully on the map she had stolen from her father's office. It was nearly midnight when she knocked on the door. She knew she was taking an enormous risk. The Thorndikes might turn her in. They might reject her entirely. They might be unwilling to be implicated in her escape. But she had nowhere else to go, no other options remaining, and the sound of horses' hooves behind her in the darkness seemed to suggest that her departure might already have been discovered. She knocked again, harder this time, her heart sounding in her ears like a drum. A light appeared in an upstairs window. A few moments later, she heard footsteps inside the house, and the door cracked open just far enough for her to see the barrel of a pistol pointed directly at her chest. The pistol in the darkness was real, but so was the trembling in the hands that held it. Elizabeth heard the hammer click back, heard the mechanism of death being set into motion, and found herself thinking not of fear, but of the absurdity that she had come all this way only to be shot on the doorstep of salvation. But then a woman's voice emerged from behind the pistol, gentle and questioning, in a way that suggested the gun was more for protection than intent. "Who are you? Are you from the Harrison household?" The question itself was stunning. The fact that this unknown Quaker woman, standing in darkness with a loaded pistol, knew Elizabeth's family name meant only one thing. Her disappearance had already been discovered, had already become a matter of active inquiry. Elizabeth's voice, when she found it, was barely a whisper. "I am Elizabeth Harrison. I have left my family. I need help reaching Philadelphia." For a long moment, nothing happened. The pistol remained fixed on Elizabeth's chest. Then, with deliberate slowness, it was lowered. The woman who held it emerged into the pale moonlight, and Elizabeth saw a face that might have been anywhere between 40 and 60 years old, weathered by decades of living a life that required constant moral choices. This was Sarah Thorndike, a woman whose abolitionist sympathies had earned her the quiet hatred of most of Charleston society, and the fervent loyalty of those who understood that slavery was an infection on the soul of America. "Come inside," Sarah Thorndike said, "before the neighbors see, before anyone sees. How long do you think we have before they come looking for you?" Elizabeth followed her into a house that was both orderly and strange, filled with books and papers in languages Elizabeth did not recognize, with engravings of important-looking black men on the walls, Frederick Douglass, Henry Highland Garnet, other names she had read in her forbidden abolitionist materials. The interior of the Thorndike house was not the home of simple people. It was the home of people who had made a deliberate choice to oppose everything their society stood for. Sarah Thorndike listened to Elizabeth's story with an expression of focused intensity, asking sharp questions that suggested she needed to understand not just what had happened, but why it had happened. What motivated this young woman to abandon everything and risk her life for a freedom that did not belong to her by law or tradition? When Elizabeth finished, Sarah sat back in her chair and studied her with eyes that seemed to strip away pretense. "Your situation is this," Sarah said finally. "Your father is likely already aware of your departure. He will almost certainly have reported you to the authorities as a runaway from family protection, claiming that you have been led astray by some man or radical abolitionist influence. He will have described you to bounty hunters and local constables. Within a week, your face will be known to every slave catcher in Charleston. Posters will appear. Your capture is nearly certain if you remain here. We can hide you for perhaps 3 days before the risks become too great. In those 3 days, we must prepare you for the journey north." What Sarah Thorndyke meant by prepare became clear over the next 72 hours. Elizabeth was given the clothes of a servant girl, dark, practical clothing that would make her disappear into the landscape of working women. Her hair was cut dramatically short, close to her scalp, a transformation so complete that when she looked in a mirror, she barely recognized herself. She was given a new name, Emily Whiting, and a cover story that she memorized until she could recite it in her sleep. She was a widow traveling north to find employment in the mills of Pennsylvania. Her husband had died of influenza and left her without means of support. She had relatives in Philadelphia who could take her in. The cover story was simple and unadorned enough that it could withstand casual questioning, but vague enough that no one could easily verify it. More importantly, Sarah taught her the signals. The broken window shade in a certain position meant a house was safe. A lantern hung on a particular hook meant food and shelter would be provided. A white chalk mark on a fence meant continue straight. A black mark meant change direction immediately. Sarah was teaching her the silent language of the Underground Railroad, the code by which hundreds of desperate people had already found their way to freedom. On the morning of January 12, 1839, Elizabeth left the Thorndyke house hidden in the back of a merchant's wagon that ostensibly contained dried fruit and salted fish bound for Wilmington, North Carolina. The reality was that the wagon also contained a false bottom, constructed with such precision that it appeared to be merely the floor of the cargo space. Beneath that false bottom lay not merchandise, but people, 3 formerly enslaved people who had found their own way to Charleston and were now attempting the return journey north. A man named Samuel, who was approximately 40 years old and had the weathered appearance of someone who had spent his entire life in hard labor. A woman named Grace, who appeared to be in her mid-20s and carried herself with a careful dignity that suggested she had once lived in circumstances far better than those of a field hand. And a young boy, no more than 8 years old, who belonged to neither Samuel nor Grace, but whom they had committed to protecting as their own blood. These were the people with whom Elizabeth would travel the approximately 400 miles to Philadelphia. These were the people with whom she would learn what freedom actually meant. These were the people who would teach her that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. The wagon moved at a deliberate pace that first day, neither fast enough to draw the attention of authorities, nor slow enough to suggest that something unusual was occurring. For the first 40 miles, from Charleston to a small town called Somerville, nothing remarkable happened. The driver, a white man named Jacob Mercer, who made his living transporting goods between Charleston and the northern states, stopped at an inn that catered to traveling merchants. He displayed his papers with casual confidence, answered the innkeeper's questions with the bland professionalism of a man who had made this journey dozens of times. He ate supper in the common room, while speaking to no one in particular about the price of dried goods and the reliability of northern buyers. Elizabeth, hidden in the false bottom with the others, experienced her first realization of what it truly meant to be fugitive. There was no air, or rather, there was air, but so little of it that each breath felt like inhaling the same exhausted oxygen that the others had already consumed. The space was barely tall enough for her to lie on her side. Samuel and Grace and the boy were pressed against each other with no possibility of moving without disturbing someone else. Hours stretched into what felt like days. Her leg cramped. She needed to urinate, but there was no possibility of doing so. The boy whimpered occasionally until Grace covered his mouth gently with her hand, not to silence him, but to comfort him, her weathered fingers stroking his hair with a tenderness that suggested a mother's touch. When they finally stopped, when Jacob lifted the false bottom and fresh air rushed into the cramped space, Elizabeth discovered that she had been underground, literally, for 16 hours. She had experienced, in abbreviated form, something of what Samuel and Grace had endured for entire years of their lives. The next phase of the journey took them inland, away from the coastal route that would be most heavily watched by slave patrols and local authorities. They traveled through South Carolina's interior, through areas where there were fewer patrols, but also fewer safe houses, through a landscape of pine forests and swamp country where the roads were barely more than wagon tracks. The rhythm of the journey became established quickly. They would travel at night or in the early hours of morning, hidden in the wagon under dried goods and legitimate cargo. They would stop at designated houses, marked on the map that Jacob carried with symbols and notations that meant nothing to the untrained eye but contained entire narratives of safety and danger to those who knew how to read them. At one house, a small farm operated by a free black man named Marcus, who had purchased his own freedom years earlier, Elizabeth experienced her second transformation. Marcus looked at her with an expression of profound skepticism, his arms crossed over his chest. "A white girl," he said to Jacob, his voice carrying an edge of accusation. "She's going to get captured, and then she's going to turn evidence against everyone who helped her. You're risking the entire network for one scared girl from a wealthy family." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, considering the weight of the objection. "She's in love with an enslaved man," he said finally, his voice low enough that only Marcus could hear. "That's why she's running. Her father was going to sell him to Louisiana. She chose this over living a comfortable life with a man she didn't love." Marcus's expression shifted. He studied Elizabeth with something that might have been respect or might have been pity. She couldn't tell which. "That's something else then," he said, finally uncrossing his arms. "That's something I understand. We'll help you. But you need to understand something. If you're caught, if you break under interrogation, if you reveal names or places or routes, you're not just betraying us. You're betraying every person on this line, every house that helps us, every life that depends on the network staying secret." Elizabeth understood. She understood with a clarity that superseded any doubt or confusion. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders like a physical thing, a burden that she would carry for the remainder of her life. The days became a blur of movement and hiding, of fear that was constant but bearable, of moments of unexpected kindness. In Raleigh, North Carolina, a woman who appeared to be white but introduced herself only as Auntie insisted on cutting Elizabeth's hair even shorter and applying a dye made from walnut husks and oak gall that turned it a deeper brown. "You'll pass better as someone from the Caribbean," Auntie said, working with practiced efficiency. "Enough people move between Charleston and the islands that no one will question it. Too many mixed heritage people travel these routes for authorities to pay close attention." In Virginia, just north of the North Carolina border, they were stopped by a patrol, militiamen on horseback, who approached the wagon with weapons visible and suspicion clearly evident on their weathered faces. Jacob remained absolutely calm. He produced papers showing that he was a legitimate merchant, transporting goods to northern buyers. He answered their questions about his cargo, his destination, his business associates. When the soldiers asked if he was carrying any fugitive slaves, Jacob looked at them with an expression of almost insulted incredulity. "Do I look like an abolitionist fool?" he said, his voice carrying the dismissive tone of a man whose sole concern was profit. "I've got cargo to move and profits to make. I don't have time for the complications of hiding runaways." It was audacious enough to work, reckless in a way that suggested Jacob understood that confidence itself was the best disguise. The soldiers waved him through without searching the wagon. In the false bottom, Elizabeth held her breath for so long she thought she might lose consciousness. Her vision began to spot and darken. When she finally released it, when she allowed air to flow into her lungs again, she felt Grace's hand squeeze hers, a gesture of wordless solidarity and shared terror. By the time they reached Pennsylvania, Elizabeth had lost count of safe houses. She had lost track of the names she had been given, the stories she had been instructed to tell, the different routes they had taken to avoid detection. She had memorized the faces of a dozen people whose names she would never know, whose real names were less important than the work they were doing. What she knew with absolute certainty was that she had traveled nearly 400 miles with people who had no obligation to protect her and who nonetheless had done so at serious personal risk. She knew that she had learned things about courage, about community, about the structure of organized resistance that all her reading of abolitionist materials had only hinted at. She knew that Samuel, Grace, and the boy, who had been strangers 3 weeks ago, had become as close to her as siblings. She knew that the boy had stopped whimpering during the hidden portions of the journey. She knew that Grace had told stories at night, when they were safely in houses, stories of a childhood before slavery, stories of learning to read, stories of daughters and sisters and mothers who had disappeared into the machinery of the slave trade. She knew that Samuel had taught her the names of the constellations used by runaways to navigate north, drinking gourd, the North Star, the patterns that slaves had memorized for generations. Philadelphia appeared to Elizabeth like a revelation of a different world. It was a city where black people walked the streets without visible fear. It was a city where abolitionists operated openly, where meeting houses hosted lectures and organizing efforts without need for secrecy. It was a city where, for the first time, Elizabeth could imagine a future that extended beyond mere survival. Jacob took them to a specific address on Delaware Street, to a narrow row house that appeared utterly unremarkable from the outside. 3 stories, brick facade, modest windows. He explained that it was operated by William Still, a man who had become something of a legend in abolitionist circles. "He's recorded the names of over 1,000 people who have passed through here," Jacob said, speaking with the respect of a man who understood the historical importance of what was happening. "He keeps careful records. He writes down their stories, their origins, where they came from. He's building a history. When slavery finally ends, and I believe it will end, people will need to know what happened, who was helped, who helped them. They'll need to know the names and the faces and the stories." They were brought to Still's office by a woman named Lucinda, who asked Elizabeth a series of careful questions in a small room lined with ledgers. Name, age, previous condition. How had she escaped? Who had helped her? Lucinda wrote it all down in a large leather-bound book, speaking as she wrote, her pen moving across the page with practiced efficiency. "When they ask where you came from, you say you were born free in Pennsylvania. When they ask about your family, you say they're dead. When they ask about connections south, you say there are none. You're going to have to believe your own story eventually, or someone will notice the inconsistencies. Lies only work if the teller truly believes them." Lucinda looked up from her writing, meeting Elizabeth's eyes with a gaze that seemed to see into her very soul. "Who is the man you left behind?" Elizabeth felt tears beginning to form and fought them back with effort. "Thomas. He is, the most important person I've ever known." Lucinda wrote this down too, adding it to the official record, making it real, making it historical. Elizabeth was given a room in a boarding house operated by a woman named Mrs. Catherine Downs, a free black woman who ran an establishment that catered to formerly enslaved people who had recently arrived in the city. For the first time since leaving Charleston, Elizabeth was allowed to remain in one place for more than a night. She was given clean clothes, real clothes, not costumes for deception. She was given fresh water and soap. She was allowed to rest, to process what she had experienced. And it was during this period of rest, perhaps a week after her arrival in Philadelphia, that she received a visitor. The man who appeared at Mrs. Downs's boarding house was tall, thin, with an intensity in his eyes that suggested he carried the weight of many people's hopes and the burden of their survival. He introduced himself as Reverend William Fisher, and he carried with him a letter that had been smuggled north through the network, carried by people willing to risk capture, passed from hand to hand through a network of safe houses, specifically so that it could reach her. The letter was sealed with wax and addressed in careful handwriting. Elizabeth recognized that handwriting immediately. In careful script that she recognized from countless quiet moments in the library, Thomas had written, "I do not know if this will reach you. I do not know if you are alive or captured or somewhere between those two states of existence. I have not slept since your father discovered your absence. I do not know if you are safe or if you are suffering, but I had to try. I had to send these words to follow you northward. The house is less without you. The library is a place of silence now, which it has never been before. I read your books, but they tell me nothing about where you are or what has become of you. Your father is searching for you with an intensity that suggests he believes you have betrayed him profoundly. The fact that he is searching means you are still alive in his mind, which is the only form of immortality that matters now. I love you. I will love you regardless of what happens. I will love you if I am sold to Louisiana. I will love you if I am freed. I will love you if I never see your face again. I will love you through whatever comes. Do not come back for me. Do not attempt a rescue. Find your peace in freedom, and know that my peace is in the knowledge that you are at least safe." Elizabeth read the letter so many times that she wore holes in the paper where her fingers repeatedly folded it. She understood that Thomas had just voluntarily severed the connection between them, had released her from any obligation to return, had given her permission to live without the weight of guilt. It was the greatest gift he could have given her, and it broke her completely. She cried in a way she had not permitted herself to cry since leaving Charleston. Not silent, controlled tears, but great heaving sobs that came from the deepest part of her being. She mourned not just the loss of him, but the impossible reality that she was alive and he was not, that she was free and he remained enslaved, that her escape had been purchased partially at the cost of his bondage. It was Reverend Fisher who brought her back from that abyss. He sat with her in the room while she cried, saying nothing, simply present. He did not try to comfort her or offer platitudes. He simply bore witness to her grief, understanding that this was something she needed to move through rather than around. When she finally found her voice, when the sobs had diminished to occasional tremors, she asked him the question that had been forming in her mind throughout her journey north. What happens now? I am alive. I am free. But what purpose does that serve if the people I love are still enslaved? What am I supposed to do with this freedom? Reverend Fisher considered the question with the gravity it deserved, taking his time before responding. Now, he said, you tell your story. You become a witness. You become a voice for those who cannot speak without risking recapture. The enslaved cannot speak for themselves without being dragged back to bondage. But you can speak. You can describe what you saw, what you experienced, what your father did, what slavery truly costs in human terms. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. Elizabeth understood what he was suggesting. She would become a voice for those who had risked their lives to help her escape. She would become a living testimony to the reality that people like her father were willing to sacrifice the lives of enslaved people, the lives of people they claimed to love, for profit and control. She would become a public figure, an ex-slaveholder's daughter who had chosen freedom and resistance over comfort and complicity. She would give speeches in churches and meeting houses. She would write articles for abolitionist newspapers. She would tell her story again and again until she had memorized it so completely that it became historical record. She would become Elizabeth Harrison, no longer, but something greater. She would become a voice crying in the wilderness, calling for the end of slavery, calling for justice, calling for her people to abandon their comfortable participation in the greatest sin America had ever committed. She was becoming something that no one, not her father, not the society that had raised her, had ever expected. The first public speech Elizabeth Harrison delivered was in the spring of 1840 in a Quaker meeting house in Philadelphia, before an audience of approximately 200 abolitionists, many of them prominent voices in the movement against slavery. She wore a simple black dress, and her hair, cut short in Charleston, had grown only slightly longer. The transformation from the terrified girl who had knocked on the Thorndike door 2 years earlier was complete. She was 20 years old. She was unknown. She was dangerous, not because she posed a physical threat, but because she represented something that the defenders of slavery could not easily dismiss or explain away. She was not an enslaved person advocating for her own freedom, which could be attributed to bias or self-interest. She was not a radical abolitionist from the North, which could be dismissed as outside agitation. She was a young white woman from one of Charleston's most prominent slaveholding families, standing publicly to denounce slavery and the man who had fathered her. Her very existence on that stage was a rebuke to everything that Southern society claimed to stand for. As she spoke that first evening, her voice was not powerful or commanding. It was measured, precise, and devastating in its quiet clarity. She described her father's auction house, the physical space where human beings were bought and sold as commodities. She described the sounds of commerce designed to maximize the efficiency of extracting profit from human flesh. She described her own moral awakening, the moment when she understood that the comfortable life she had been given was purchased with the suffering of thousands of people. She described Thomas, though she did not use his name. She described a man who had been stolen from his home, enslaved, sold, and held captive by the only man she was supposed to love and obey with absolute deference. And then she described her choice, to abandon her family, her inheritance, her social position, Everything she had been raised to believe mattered for the possibility that she could live with integrity. When she finished speaking, there was a moment of complete silence. No one applauded. No one made a sound. It was as though the audience had collectively held its breath and needed a moment to remember how to exhale. Then, Lucretia Mott, one of the most prominent female abolitionists in the country, and one of the very few women whose voice was respected in what remained a largely male-dominated movement, stood and began to applaud. Others followed. The applause built until the small meeting house seemed to vibrate with the accumulated sound. That single speech established Elizabeth Harrison not just as an abolitionist, but as a unique voice within the movement, the voice of privilege turned against itself, the voice of someone who had everything and chose to sacrifice it all. In the years that followed, Elizabeth became one of the most active female speakers on the abolitionist lecture circuit. She traveled to Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and as far north as Massachusetts, speaking in churches and meeting houses to audiences of varying sizes. She was frequently the only woman on stage, and she encountered resistance from male abolitionists who believed that women speaking publicly was inappropriate, that it undermined the moral force of the message, that it would be used against the movement by those who already mocked abolitionists as radicals and moral extremists. But Lucretia Mott defended her, and so did others. Gradually, the message of a slaveholder's daughter speaking against slavery became one of the most powerful tools in the abolitionist arsenal. Elizabeth wrote articles for abolitionist newspapers and journals. She contributed to books and pamphlets that documented the realities of slavery. She gave testimony before anti-slavery societies and helped organize debates with pro-slavery advocates. She participated in the famous anti-slavery bazaars that were organized in northern cities, where women sold goods made without slave labor and raised money to support the abolitionist cause. Her face became known. Her name became recognized. She was famous in the way that controversial figures become famous in social movements, admired by some and vilified by others, always discussed, always debated, always remembered. By the late 1840s, the conflict between North and South was intensifying rapidly. The question of whether slavery would be permitted to expand into new territories dominated American politics and consumed the nation's attention. The Compromise of 1850, meant to ease tensions, satisfied no one. By 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act had essentially declared that the question of slavery in new territories would be decided by popular sovereignty and vote, a decision that unleashed violence and bloodshed in the territories. The nation was being pulled toward civil war like objects falling toward gravity. And through all of this turmoil, Elizabeth continued to speak, to write, to organize. She became one of the voices arguing that compromise with slavery was impossible, that slavery was not a sectional issue, but a national sin, that the entire nation was complicit in the brutality that defined the system. She received letters from enslaved people who had somehow learned of her, who sent her messages of encouragement through the networks that connected the black community throughout the nation. She received letters from women in the South who had begun to question the slavery their families had built their fortunes upon. She received letters from men who had once known her father, men from Charleston society, expressing their shame at what slavery had done to their nation and crediting her public testimony with awakening their conscience. But she also received other letters, letters from her father, now an old man living in Charleston, letters that she never read fully, letters that she burned in the fireplace without allowing herself to understand their complete content. A letter arrived after her mother died in 1852, forwarded through multiple addresses, asking her to return home for the funeral. She did not go. She could not. She had chosen this path, and she had understood from the beginning what it would cost her. Her father died in 1858, and she learned of his death through a newspaper notice. There was no inheritance waiting for her. He had written her out of his will entirely. Her siblings were instructed never to acknowledge her as family. It was as though she had died the night she walked away from Charleston. And this was merely the formal documentation of what had already occurred. And then, in April of 1861, the war that everyone had been predicting, dreading, and desperately hoping might be avoided finally arrived. The Confederate attack on Fort Sumter plunged the nation into civil war. The moment of reckoning that the abolitionists had long anticipated had finally come. What no one could have predicted was that the war would ultimately become not just a war for the preservation of the Union, but a war for emancipation itself. What no one could have predicted was that by the time the war ended, slavery itself would have been abolished by constitutional amendment. In 1862, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which would free all enslaved people in states that remained in rebellion as of January 1st, 1863. It was not the sweeping action that radical abolitionists had demanded, but it was something. It was an acknowledgement that slavery was central to the conflict, that the war could not be won without addressing slavery directly. Elizabeth was 32 years old when the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. She was working at this time for the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, what would become known as the Freedmen's Bureau, helping formerly enslaved people settle in Philadelphia and find employment. She was helping to interview people arriving from the South, documenting their stories, creating records that would become historical testimony. In this work, she encountered dozens of people who had escaped slavery through the same networks that had helped her escape. She encountered people who had been inspired to flee slavery by the stories of resistance and freedom that had circulated through enslaved communities. She encountered people who had heard of a slaveholder's daughter, who had chosen freedom over privilege, and who had found in her story a model of what was possible when someone refused to accept injustice. It was in this work that she encountered someone who changed everything. She was interviewing a man in 1863, a man who had escaped from a plantation in Louisiana just weeks before, when he mentioned the name of the plantation from which he had come. It was one owned by a distant relative of her father's, a man she had met once as a child at a family gathering in Charleston. The formerly enslaved man, who gave his name as Samuel Freeman, described the conditions on the plantation, the brutal overseers, the system of punishment and control designed to break human spirits. And then, as though reporting a piece of minor information, he mentioned that a man named Thomas had been working in the plantation house, that Thomas had been exceptionally intelligent and had been taught to read by a previous overseer before slavery had made such learning illegal, that Thomas had been instrumental in helping at least 20 people escape from the plantation over a period of several years before he himself had disappeared. "No one knows what became of him," Samuel Freeman said. "Some thought he was killed trying to escape. Others thought he had successfully reached the North. But he never came back, and those who loved him held on to the hope that he had found freedom somewhere." Elizabeth was barely able to continue the interview. Her hands were trembling visibly. Her mind was racing with possibilities that she had forced herself not to entertain for more than 20 years. Could it be? Could Thomas still be alive somewhere in the North? Could he have found his own way to freedom? Or had he died in the attempt, as so many had? She finished the interview in a state of distraction. She wrote up her report that evening, and then she began to search methodically and desperately. She searched through the records at William Still's office, looking through thousands of names for any indication that Thomas had passed through Philadelphia. She contacted abolitionists and Freedmen's Bureau officers throughout the North. She asked friends to inquire among people they knew. She published notices in newspapers and abolitionist journals, seeking information about a man named Thomas, approximately 60 years old, formerly enslaved in South Carolina and later Louisiana, distinguished by literacy and exceptional courage, believed to have escaped slavery sometime in the 1850s. Any information gratefully received and will be treated with utmost confidentiality. The response was not immediate, but gradually information began to arrive through the networks of abolitionists and free black communities throughout the North. A man who matched Thomas's description had appeared in the records of the Philadelphia Underground Railroad in 1849, brought north by Thomas Garrett, the legendary Quaker who had assisted over 2,000 people in their escape to freedom. The records did not identify him by his full name, only by the designation he had chosen for himself, Thomas Freeman. The date of his arrival was approximately 8 years after Elizabeth had reached Philadelphia, 8 years during which she had believed he might be dead, destroyed by Louisiana's brutal system. 8 years during which she had lived with the guilt of her own escape, the knowledge that her freedom had been purchased by his continued enslavement, and during all those years, unknown to her, he had been planning his own escape, working toward his own freedom, executing the most patient and careful escape recorded in the Underground Railroad's documents. Thomas Garrett's carefully maintained notes indicated that Thomas Freeman had come north, had found employment in Philadelphia as a free man, had become active in the expanding black community, had married a woman named Clara, who had also escaped slavery, and had eventually purchased property. When the war began, he had immediately volunteered with the Union Army. He had served in the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Regiment, one of the first regiments to permit black soldiers to serve as combat troops, rather than merely as laborers and support personnel. He had fought at Fort Wagner, one of the bloodiest battles of the war, where the 54th suffered devastating casualties. He had survived the war, according to the records, and had received an honorable discharge. As of the date of the last record maintained by the Freedmen's Bureau, he was living in Boston with his wife and 2 children. Elizabeth's hands were shaking as she read the final entry in the letter from a friend in Boston who had been able to verify this information. Thomas was alive. He had been alive all these years. He had found his own way to freedom, had built a life, had married and created a family, had fought for the Union and the cause of freedom. He had done what she could not force herself to imagine. He had survived without her assistance. He had thrived beyond her wildest hopes. He had found his own path to freedom without waiting for her to rescue him or come back for him. She wrote him a letter, and then she rewrote it. It took her 3 days to find the right words. 3 days of false starts and crossed-out passages. 3 days of sitting at her desk with tears streaming down her face. Finally, on the 4th day, she wrote, "I do not know if this letter will reach you. I do not know if you will remember me, or if you prefer to forget the world from which we both escaped. I have learned that you found your freedom, that you built a life in the North, that you survived the war. I need you to know this. Your life, your survival, your freedom. These things have mattered more to me than my own comfort. Every time I have felt despair, every time I have questioned whether my work matters, I have thought of you, of the possibility that you might be alive, that you might have found peace. To learn that you did, that you have, is the greatest gift I could ever receive." She sealed the letter carefully, using wax to make a seal. She sent it to Boston, addressed to Thomas Freeman, care of the black community organizations in the city. The response came 3 weeks later, in a handwriting she did not recognize, but in a tone she would have recognized anywhere, even after 25 years. "Elizabeth," he wrote, "I received your letter yesterday, and I wept when I read it. I have spent these 20 years believing that you were either dead, lost to slavery, or captured by slave catchers, or married to some northern man, living a life that no longer included me. The reality that you have spent all this time thinking of me, working for freedom, becoming the voice of conscience that the nation needed, this reality is overwhelming. I never dared to hope that you would still be alive, that you would still remember me. But you did. You have. And knowing that, my life feels complete in a way it never has before. I cannot come to Philadelphia. My life is built here in Boston now. My wife and children are here. My roots are here. But I want you to know that whatever I have accomplished in this life, I accomplished it because I loved you, and because loving you taught me what freedom truly meant. I send my love across all the years and all the distance. I will love you until the day I die." By the time Thomas's letter arrived, the Civil War had officially ended. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox in April of 1865. Slavery had been abolished by the 13th Amendment. The nation was beginning the long, painful process of Reconstruction, of attempting to rebuild itself around the principle that all people, regardless of race, were human beings entitled to basic rights and dignity. Elizabeth was 35 years old. She had given 25 years of her life to this struggle. She had lost everything and found that in the losing, she had discovered what truly mattered. She had lost her family, her inheritance, her social position, her romantic love. And in exchange, she had found her purpose, her voice, her freedom, and the knowledge that her sacrifice had mattered. She continued her work through the Reconstruction era, helping formerly enslaved people settle in the North, advocating for education and employment opportunities, pushing for the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments that would guarantee civil rights and voting rights to all people regardless of race. But she never married. She never accepted proposals from men who admired her work. When people asked her why she remained unmarried, she would smile and say that she was already married to the cause of freedom. She was, in a very real sense. She had made a choice 25 years earlier to sacrifice personal happiness for the possibility of justice and equality. That choice had cost her everything, and it had also, paradoxically, given her a life of meaning and purpose that she would not have traded for anything. By 1875, when Reconstruction officially ended and the nation began the long, deliberate betrayal of its promises to formerly enslaved people, Elizabeth was 55 years old. She was worn by 2.5 decades of unrelenting work, of fighting battles that sometimes seemed unwinnable, of witnessing the gradual rollback of freedoms that had been so hard won. She was tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. She decided to step back from public life. She took a small position working at a school for black children in Philadelphia, teaching reading and history. She lived simply in a small cottage on a modest street, on a modest salary. She gave up the platform, she gave up the speeches, she gave up the public recognition and the debates. And in giving all of that up, she found a kind of peace that she had not known was possible. The historical record loses track of Elizabeth Harrison after 1875. There are no more public speeches recorded in newspapers or abolitionist journals. There are no more articles published under her name. There are no more official records or letters in the historical archives. She disappears from the public record entirely. Some historians have speculated that she died in obscurity, forgotten by the nation she had helped save. Others have suggested that she moved further north, possibly to Boston to be near Thomas, possibly to Canada, seeking a quieter life away from the increasing racial violence and oppression of the post-Reconstruction era. A few have wondered if she used a different name, if she deliberately attempted to erase herself from history, but the truth was something else entirely. The historical record did not lose track of Elizabeth Harrison. Elizabeth Harrison deliberately faded from the record. She had spent a quarter century being a public voice for others, and she understood that the work of freedom was not something that could be measured in public recognition or historical prominence. She understood that meaning lived in the small acts of teaching, in the quiet moments of connection with a child learning to read, in the conversations with formerly enslaved people who were learning to rebuild their lives and claim their freedom. She understood that her life had mattered, that her sacrifice had been meaningful, that her choices had helped shift the course of a nation toward justice. And she understood that she did not need to be remembered or celebrated for any of that to be true. What is known is this: Elizabeth Harrison lived until 1891. She died quietly, of pneumonia, at the age of 71, in the small cottage where she had lived for 16 years. The Philadelphia newspapers barely mentioned her death. The abolitionist press, which had once celebrated her name and quoted her speeches, had largely ceased publication or moved on to other concerns and other causes. Very few people at her funeral understood who she had been or what she had accomplished. Very few understood that the quiet woman being laid to rest had once been at the forefront of one of the great moral movements of the age. Very few understood that she had been willing to sacrifice everything: her family, her inheritance, her future, even her own romantic love and the possibility of marriage and children, for the possibility of freedom and justice for people she had never met, people who belonged to a race different from her own, people who had no legal claim to her loyalty or support. Very few understood any of this, but that understanding, or lack thereof, did not change the reality. It did not diminish what she had accomplished. It did not erase the impact of her choices. And so, we come to the end of this story. Not the end of slavery that ended in 1865, ratified by constitutional amendment, though its legacy would poison American life for another century and a half, and continue to the present day. Not the end of the struggle for freedom that continues to this day as people throughout the world continue to work for justice and equality and the recognition of basic human rights. But the end of Elizabeth Harrison's story. The story of a young woman who lived in contradiction, who was born into privilege and chose to renounce it entirely, who loved a man whom she could not marry and chose to fight instead for the freedom of millions, who gave up everything for the possibility of a more just world. The question we might ask ourselves is this: what would we have done? Had we been born into that privilege, into that comfort, into a world that taught us that injustice was natural and moral and divinely ordained? What would we have chosen? Would we have had the courage to walk away as Elizabeth did? Would we have been willing to sacrifice everything we had been taught to value for an abstract principle of justice? Would we have had the strength to become a voice for people who could not speak, even when it meant losing our family, our inheritance, our future? These are the questions that Elizabeth Harrison's life forces us to consider. These are the questions that her sacrifice demands we answer for ourselves. Because the work of freedom is not something that ended in 1865. The work of freedom is something that continues in every generation, in every moment, when someone chooses justice over comfort, solidarity over privilege, conscience over convenience. And Elizabeth Harrison is a reminder, a living, breathing, historical reminder that such choices are possible, that they are real, that they matter, that one person's willingness to sacrifice everything can help change the course of history.